Thanks for the presentation to Mogens. I am representing the Danish Global Compact Network, and it seems that you all know Global Compact, which is really great. Then I'll just skip some of the introductions and just go straight to how we move into an action space. If you want me to start with the question, I'll do that. But maybe we could also take a discussion later. I think the question is whether we will do it, if we will reach the global goals voluntarily, or whether it will be necessary to speed up the process around legislation. And of course, my opinion is that it needs to be attractive for a company to do it. So you can't expect a company to just do this without it being followed up by legislation. And I think some of the larger Danish companies that have made very, very significant commitments to climate change, they also expect that the legislation will follow and that it will come eventually. So that's part of the discussion, but I'll be very happy to discuss this further on. We've had the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, for 4 years now, and we have a very broad understanding. Danish people know them, and we also know them all around the world. What's very significant and important about this new agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement again, is that we have to change. Mogens said that as well. We cannot continue with consumption and production as we do it now. I think that's well established. But still, I think the business case needs to be more pinpointed. We're making new global championships every year. We are beating last year's heating standards, so the world is getting warmer and warmer. It's scientifically proven, and all the expectations that we have proven to be right or worse. So the glaciers are melting at a higher pace than we had expected, and the temperatures are rising. So the why is beginning to be very strong, and I think from the climate summit in New York in September, this was also very well established. Everyone accepted the fact that we have some problems, of course, except Donald Trump. But I'll get back to that. This is just a picture of Copenhagen at the current temperature. And just to give you an indication of the expectations of flooding, on a 1.5 climate rise, which is what we are aiming at, but right now we're not on track. Someone asked, we're not on track. We have to really, really cut emissions to just reach this. This is what we will get at 2.5 climate rise. So you can see the most of Amager will be flooded. So we are facing some serious climate changes in the future. If you go around the world, people are experiencing this in especially the poorer parts of the world. There wasn't a climate action summit in September. I heard the presentation by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and the business leaders are beginning to talk about taking action. They are committing. He had a very strong case for not business leaders, presidents and the governments in countries to take action for climate. But he also addressed the business community, because we cannot do this without the business community. So of course there is a real need for businesses to step up. You asked a question about Greta Thunberg and the activism. Greta Thunberg, I just heard, she is one of the most well-known persons in the whole world right now. Everyone knows her, from Sudan to New Zealand to southern Chile. People have heard about her. And I think this activism and the knowledge that people have different opinions about her, but she is really getting her voice through. We had demonstrations with young people. More than 5 million people were on the streets actively demonstrating their opinion on businesses and government leaders to take action. She's also looking at these eternal fairy tales about economic growth she was addressing. And I think the whole idea of economic growth as a driver is also challenged by this young voice and the activism. And that's very interesting also for business. At the same time, I think business, and Mogens also mentioned that, is the key to the solutions. We need exponential change in the ways we do things. And you are the key to that. You are the key to finding the solutions that we need. It cannot be done by governments. So we need this interaction, and we need a collaboration between governments and businesses. And of course, is there a business case for this? In my opinion, it should not be, there should not be a business case for a business that is emitting a lot of CO2, because you are damaging the world and someone has to clean it up. So of course, there should be a business case for a company to be green and to be researching in solutions and finding ways to reduce emissions, and even maybe eat emissions, so that we would, eat the CO2 and make drastic changes. And that's also possible. It was very inspiring to be part of the SDG Business Forum, because there are a lot of ideas and there's a lot of dedication. Also frustration, because the business case is not there yet. You said it's a very strong business case, and I totally agree with you. But for many companies, you still have to grasp doing business as usual is still the way we do things. How can we really turn this? Can it make sense to spend so much money on finding new ways to cutting our emissions? Can we make a very, very strong target for this and this year without losing money? And I think that's the discussion space we need to get into. Lea will get into how, but we also need to discuss the political frames around this. How is Denmark? I often hear the politicians say that we are really good in Denmark. And I'm also, when I'm in New York and when I'm traveling, I feel proud, because I think we have some very, very strong business leaders. Henrik Poulsen from Ørsted was on the scene at the UN Climate Summit after Greta Thunberg, representing a business that has really done it. They have made a very drastic change, going from oil and gas to pure green energy. And I think that's a very strong voice, and that it makes me proud to be a Dane when we have these strong business people. Mads Nipper was also there a few years ago, and we have a Maersk that is a company that's part of the problem. They are emitting a lot of CO2, but they have made a very bold ambition to reduce this to zero by 2050. So, and they're also part of this Science-Based Targets initiative. But we have the world record in producing waste per citizen or per person in Denmark, and that's not a very great world record to hold. We are also not reusing it in Denmark. We're sending it out, and we need to find solutions for that. I also think businesses have a very strong case here to find these solutions. You all know Global Compact. I represent the global organization. We are founded in the UN. Kofi Annan suggested this compact between government and business in 1999, and in 2000, Global Compact was established. We represent a little less than 10,000 businesses around the world that has committed to the 10 principles. And I was told, you all say Global Compact, you know the 10 principles, so I won't talk a lot about that, but it's a commitment to human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. What's our value proposition? We build trust and transparency. It's a platform for publicly communicate your commitment. You have a CEO commitment and you reconfirm it every year. So you can make sure that you are a company that wants to work with it. And then we of course provide guidance and training and a global partnership At the moment, we have 67 local networks around the world. The Danish network was established only 1.5 years ago, so we're a very new network. We had a Nordic network before that, and right now we're around 335 Danish businesses. Half of our companies are SMEs, and the other half are larger companies. Now I want to get into the action space, because what is it we do and what is the talk and how do you actually get started? Lea will talk a lot more about how to work with the science-based targets. I'm going to hold it like this. But from my perspective and using the Global Compact as a framework, there was a question about greenwashing, and I've also heard this term SDG washing. Because we tend to go with the good stories. Often the corporate responsibility is also based within public affairs. So you want to get out with the good stories. You want to tell what your company is doing to address some of these issues. The challenge is that sometimes we forget to look at where are we having negative impact. So using the Global Compact as a framework, you really have to look into your own business case and say, okay, where do we have the negative impact? Where might there be some issues that we need to address? Find out what's material to your business and make some commitments to action and look at it every year. So it's about the human rights, it's about the labor, it's also about environment. And this is the theme of today with climate action, and then it's about anti-corruption. Global Compact also has a very strong mandate to advocate about the SDGs for the business community. And from our opinion, of course, you can do a lot of action, but you really need to look at your business case. So if you are not part of the problem, and if you are reducing your CO2 emissions, you are contributing to the SDGs very significantly. So this is where you start. So don't look only at the SDGs as the good stories, but also that a good story could be a story like the one Maersk has made. They want to cut to zero by 2050, and that's the very strong case for them to show. Are there any questions coming up? Then
there is one right at the bottom around criticism in the context of tree planting, land grabbing, monoculture plantations. Your comments on that's been levelled at the...
Yeah, we have a lot of discussions about that internally, because some companies say, but we can't stop flying. What do we do? And there are some dilemmas, a lot of dilemmas in this. I think the whole Greta Thunberg is also showing this dilemma very, very openly. She took a boat to get to the UN, but I heard that 3 or 4 or 5 people were flown to New York to take the boat back. So these dilemmas we're facing all the time, and companies are facing these dilemmas. So tree planting might be a good idea if you really can't reduce your emissions at all. But I would say, look at your business case. What are you transporting? What are you transporting? Where are you getting it from? What waste are you generating? How is it produced? Look into that. Where are your most severely negative impacts? And really look into how do you reduce them. So I think the tree planting is really the last thing to go to, because it's philanthropy, or it could be mistaken as philanthropy if you just say, but we donate something and then we can just continue business as usual. That's not the case. Business as usual is not an option anymore. We really have to look at the business case. Okay, then we have the science-based targets, and I'll look into Lea, but this is a pledge for businesses to really look into how you can also work with your own climate footprint. We launched this business ambition for 1.5 a few years back, I think. And I'll just give you a brief number, and then I'll give the word to Lea. But until now, 283 companies have approved targets, and 391 are formally committed to the science-based targets. What's interesting about this is that this figure is rising significantly. I had some, in my slide deck, I had some other numbers because they were from the end of August, and Leah just corrected me and said, no, we're a lot more now. So we get a lot of businesses committing to the science-based targets right now and just during the last month. The same case for Denmark. The numbers are not that significant, but we have 6 companies that have approved targets, 7 formally committed to the science-based targets, and 6 that are within the campaign. So this is where I give the word to Leah, because she's really the how can we then do it and how do we work with them. So I'll give the word to you, and I'm just sitting right here to...
Just before you go, there is one further question which I think you can answer, Sarah, about how do you see the future of paid membership to the Global Compact when SDGs are more hyped and for free?
I think there's no dichotomy with the SDGs and the Global Compact. It's 2 different things. Global Compact is a global organization of companies that are committed to the 10 principles. And the 10 principles are really about business. If you look at the SDGs, it's about the world. It's very difficult for companies to see themselves in all the targets. So we are a framework, and we are the how to actually work with it. So we are not 2 different things. I've heard this before, and it always is a little bit strange to me that you think, okay, now we have the SDGs, so we don't have to look into to the 10 principles and how we actually conduct business. We can just have a story about how we work with climate. I think we're the toolbox, and we're also the network where we get the how to do it. Science-based targets is one. We have a lot of working groups. Yesterday, I was with the Young SDG Innovator Program, where we had young people from 26 companies gathered on how to make breakthrough innovation for the SDGs. So it's about driving action within the companies, and we're trying to gather people to also discuss the challenges and what's difficult, and the how in all the areas: human rights, anti-corruption, and so. So I think it's a good question, but I don't think it's 2 different things. It's part of the same. Any more questions? I'll be glad to answer them later.
Thank you, Sara. I think the toolbox to drive action within your companies is a very good transition to this more practical part. So I have the pleasure to deep dive with you into science-based target setting today. I represent CDP. I work for CDP Europe, and I'm part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That is a partner-led effort between UNGC, CDP, WWF, and the World Resource Institute. So I don't think that we have to go into detail on this slide in this room. We all know there's a gap to close from where we are and where we need to be, and we also, I think, all agree that the private sector has a very big responsibility of closing that gap. But sometimes the question still is, how can companies actually, effectively do their part to close this gap together? So I want to speak about generally ambitious target setting today, because measurable ambitious targets are the solution in our eyes. And this is also where the Women Business Coalition Take Action platform comes in. The Women Business Coalition is a conglomerate of 7 NGOs. And in the lead up to Paris, we created that platform to group ambitious climate action initiatives that are led by different organizations all over the world in one place, to have, to group leading companies globally that already recognize the need for a rapid transition to a zero carbon economy and want this toolbox that Sara was mentioning as well. And mainly we focus on 4 priority initiatives. I think it's around 13 initiatives in total. Most prominent one is the Science Based Targets Initiative, and then we have RE100 with the target to get to 100% renewable electricity sourcing at a target before 2050. We have EP100 about smart energy use, companies committing to double their energy productivity within 25 years, and EV100 on electromobility, which is the commitment to either transition your corporate fleet to EVs and hybrids, and or implementing charging infrastructure for employees and customers. So what we then do with these more than 1,000 companies that have made these commitments, we catalyze that private sector voice and bring it to policymakers and try to also translate between these two different groups to, on the one hand, show what's feasible, show the policymakers what's feasible, and also try to communicate how an enabling policy framework for ambitious corporate action and security in that area looks like. And some of you might be responding to CDP, so we have that climate action leadership piece very much embedded in what we call the company's journey, and it's obviously not always a linear process, but it really links as well with our scoring concept. Starting with disclosure, with just being transparent about your environmental footprint, to awareness, to management, to then actually take action where necessary, and then towards environmental stewardship. And these, as a global NGO, together and very well connected with others in that scene, we see our responsibility in defining what corporate climate leadership needs to look like, but also to help companies to actually deliver on these asks that are constantly changing, right? So we see it's a very dynamic field, and I think the business ambition for 1.5 degree campaign is the most recent example of another commitment, you could say. And I've spoken to companies that said, seriously, another one? Like, why? But the reason is that there is we need these campaigns, and we need the commitments as well, especially for the high-level events such as the summit, to really group these messages, to then make it best practice. And then we need to also have the toolbox to actually deliver on these commitments, and otherwise, obviously, they're not worth much. So, Sara already mentioned the campaign. So the 1.5 degree campaign was launched in June, specifically leading up to the summit that happened on 23rd of September. It's a call to action by UN leaders and civil society, really to call on companies to not only set climate targets that are aligned with what's necessary, aligned with what the science tells us we need to do, but actually aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway within that area of science-based pathways. We were very happy, actually, about these numbers, the uptake of companies and the regional diversity as well as sectoral diversity of companies that joined this campaign was really great. So we now have 95 companies, with, as Sara said, 6 from Denmark. And the how. So the campaign itself, I think, is quite shiny, and had a lot of media attention, a lot of attention at the summit. But the details are actually very technical and quite tricky, and quite complex. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but this is the opposite of greenwashing, because if actually we might have a company committing and not doing it. Okay, that's a risk that remains, but if all these companies are actually doing this is very impressive, because it's ambitious it's really ambitious action that we're asking for here. So companies join by signing the 1.5 degree pledge. And the pledge gives them two options. They can tick one or both. The first one is to set science-based targets across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, all aligned with 1.5 degree aligned emission reduction scenarios. And I will go into that in more detail in a minute. But just to already get a rough understanding, this is a 4.2% absolute reduction per year across your whole operations and value chains. And the second option is to set scope 1 and 2 targets based on that 4.2% reduction, so based on 1.5 degree scenarios. A scope 3 target that can, let's say that we allow a little bit more flexibility, and I'm going to speak more about that in the afternoon, where we have the pleasure to deep dive into scope 3 because we all love it. And so you have more flexibility on scope 3, but then companies need to set a net zero 2050 target in addition. So that's why we have these two options, science-based targets and the net zero commitment. So again, commitments. The pledge says that within 2 years, companies actually have to set these targets. And both of these options are based on the Science Based Targets Initiative framework. So if companies join the campaign, they have to formally join the initiative. And actually, and we don't have time also to talk about this in a lot of detail today, but you've all seen that, or maybe some of you have done that, that a lot of companies are now setting net zero targets, climate neutrality targets, and there is a bit of a chaos as well out there of different claims and different understandings of what that actually means. So the companies, the 95 companies that joined that campaign, we've had many of them that were asking, like, okay, you make us commit to net zero targets within 2050, what do you want us to do? It's like, do you already, like, what does that mean exactly? And we kind of had to tell them that we don't 100% know yet. But we know that we will have to find a robust and common understanding of what corporate net zero targets look like. And it's quite urgent that we develop that common understanding and act on it very soon. So in the pledge, there's a FAQ part, and there's one question, or let's say there's a working definition on net zero that the UN Global Compact, Women Business and the Science Based Targets Initiative have agreed on, under the condition that we are refining that definition at the moment in a consultative process, and we will publish guidelines on corporate net zero target setting by COP, so in December. But the working definition is essentially that companies reach net zero emissions within their value chain again, and that their business is not resulting in no net impact on the climate from emissions. And this is achieved by essentially decarbonizing as much as possible by having this short to medium time frame 1.5 degree aligned science-based reduction pathways. And then we will figure out what to do with the residual emissions, which is obviously going to be carbon sequestration to a certain extent. But as Sara just said, we need to all focus on the next years now instead of carbon sequestration, which will be necessary to make up for some residual emissions. So as I said, by the time of COP in December, we will launch these guidelines, and then hope as well that we have more and more companies setting these net zero targets based on a common understanding to really really motivate policymakers to step up their game on the NDCs for the COP26 next year. So how does it actually work to set science-based targets? there's always a bit of a challenge in the amount of technical detail to go into with every audience. So I would like you to answer the question on Slido, just to get a better understanding where you are at. Do you know what SPTs are? Do you already have approved SPTs? So, yeah, that will help me a little bit. All right. Okay. Vast majority considering feasibility. What are SBTs is also quite prominent. Okay, so I will try to touch on all of these areas a little bit, and then we can, well, I'm also here for more sector-specific or company-specific questions if they're not adequately covered by the presentation. So the Science Based Targets Initiative itself, as I said, is a partnership of these 4 organizations. We now have 676 companies that have joined the initiative. Out of these, we have 283 companies that went through the process of getting their climate targets validated and now basically have that stamp, great, your targets are aligned with the Science Based Targets Initiative's criteria. We've seen a rapid uptake since 2015 until today, with always peaks around these events where we have typically also some very specific campaigns. So this year the 1.5 campaign. Last year we had the Mahindra Challenge. I don't know whether you've heard of it, where the CEO of the Mahindra Group in India called on all businesses globally to set science-based targets before the Global Climate Action Summit to get to 500 companies globally, which we then almost did, but now we're at almost 700. So that's fantastic. To answer the question, what are SBTs? In theory, that's an easy one. In practice, it mostly takes a little bit longer to understand in detail. But the general concept is simple. They are climate targets based on what the science is telling us is required to keep global temperature levels aligned with what we agreed on in the Paris Agreement. So below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. And I will quickly present the criteria in a second, but the time frame of 5 to 15 years. So they're short to medium time targets that put companies on the right track towards reaching targets such as net zero 2050 targets, and to already now build this internal frameworks for decision making, but also, of course, a great tool to externally communicate that you're not randomly choosing targets that sound nice, but do what is necessary. The process is, and I think also that links nicely to the title of the workshop again, is to commit, signing a commitment letter saying we're committed to develop SPTs in the next 2 years. Companies are then on the website, they count towards these almost 700 companies, and then they're developing their targets, which is also where we have a lot of resources and guidance and methods available, and we're also here to help you, and it's often less hard than it seems in the beginning. Then once these targets are developed, companies submit them to us for validation, and if they're approved, they're announced on the website. There's different elements of a science-based target. It always starts with a global carbon budget. How much can the world still emit? That budget varies between different climate scenarios. As soon as you've chosen a scenario, a budget, such as 1.5 degree, the question is, how do we allocate this budget across different sectors, across different companies, and what does it mean for my company? What should I do with this budget? So science-based target setting methods are really nothing else than carbon budget allocation methods. And the most important ones are the absolute-based approach and the sector-based approach. And then the third aspect is, well, defining how your target will look like depending on your sector, on the hotspots of your emissions, how much data do you already have, how much will you grow, etc., etc. So this is just to give a very quick overview on the two main methods. And I'm sorry for the slide being slightly messed up and formatting. So the concept of the absolute-based approach is really simple. We ask all companies to decarbonize at the same rate that the IPCC is asking the global economy to decarbonize in. So you can see it does not matter where company A, B, C, D start from. They have to reduce at the same linear annual reduction rate, absolute reduction rates, and they are equal across all sectors. And I will show you how high these absolute reduction rates are in a second. And the sector-based approach, also called sectoral decarbonization approach, SDA, convergence approach, all the same, we just like to make it complicated, is very different than the absolute-based approach. You can see here on that graphs, okay, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but the black line here is supposed to be the sector intensity path. And this is based on, well, it has to, well, how to start? Okay, so the International Energy Agency is developing these paths based on specific sector technologies that we expect to be implemented over the next years in order to reach a certain temperature target. So that only works for homogeneous sectors. So let's take a cement company. They know we're producing a ton of cement today at this rate, and the IEA then says in order for the world to reach the 1.5 degree target in 2030, every cement company needs to have deployed this and this technology, taking into consideration the global growth projections for the cement sector then. So by that time, every cement company needs to have at least this low level of intensity of production. So it's a convergence approach. And here, it does matter where a company starts from, because if you're starting at a really high intensity, you have to have, well, you have a harder job to do than someone that's already quite efficient and climate friendly in their production techniques. So we have this approach for cement, iron and steel, pulp and paper, power generation, and buildings. That's it. All other sectors need to use the absolute-based approach. And yeah, so in October 2018, IPCC launched a special report on 1.5 degrees, us being called Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we obviously needed to act on this and refine our framework in order to reflect this very stark reminder that what we thought was necessary wasn't ambitious enough, and that we have to step up our game, all of us, and we need to enable companies to do that, and again provide a toolbox and actually acting on this new piece of science. So we have changed our framework, and all these changes, we announced this in the beginning of 2019, and all of these changes came into force last week on October 15th. So we've increased the minimum level of ambition from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. So from now on, we're only accepting well below 2 degree targets, encouraging 1.5 degree alignment. And we are disclosing the level of ambition of approved targets on the website. So you can now go on the website and see how many Danish companies have 2 degree compliant targets, 1.5 degree compliant targets, etc. That's a great change, I think. And yeah, with that launch of the new criteria, we've also launched a lot of new resources, and a tool that you can use to model your targets are freely available on our website. And these are the absolute rates that I just talked about. So and this is only for scope 1 and 2 target setting. The 2 degree alignment used to be 1.23% per year. And for well below 2 degrees, we ask for a 2.5% reduction per year, and for 1.5 degree alignment, 4.2% reduction per year.
Can I just pick a question? There's a question up on there, and also a follow-up question to what you've been talking about. So the first one down there is the appropriate removal of carbon. How is that validated and secured for the future?
Well, it is not yet, and it cannot be yet, because there's no global understanding or on standard on even the accounting part of carbon removals. So that's a problem. We want to get to the point where we can set quality standards and actually criteria similar to our other targets to be able to easily assess whether that's acceptable or not. The amount of carbon removals as well as the type of carbon removals, but we're really not there yet. So it's a collective, ongoing, very active process. If you want to be involved, let us know. We're just going into an open consultation process on the first scientific paper on the guiding principles on net zero targets, and this will translate it into, well, actual hands-on guidance next year. So we really hope that by the end of 2020, together with a lot of scientific institutions and other NGOs and companies that have been setting these targets, working towards these targets, that together we develop a robust framework that is then at some point even going to enable us maybe to validate them, or at least to have as good understanding.
And the second, I'm trying to link the question I had and also one up there. So the one up there is what do you do to attract more companies into CDP and the 1.5 degree pledge? And when you're thinking about that, also the people who have made science-based targets commitments, but are now essentially they were at say 2 degrees, and now they're with the shift to 1.5 degrees or well below. Does that mean they have to resubmit and realign their goals? And how long do they have to do that?
Yeah, so they don't have to do that. So all approved targets stay approved. That just only applies to new targets. So we will keep on having 2 degree aligned targets, but by 2025 we will ask them to align them with the set of criteria that will be in place in 2025. So that might change indeed. And the question how we attract more companies, good question. We're also thinking about that every day. It's different for CDP and 1.5 degree pledge. For CDP, and CDP's main activity, as you probably know, is transparency on the corporate and other stakeholders' environmental footprint. And for companies, we let investors do that. And that works pretty well. So we just work with institutional investors requesting the companies they're investing in to report to CDP. And if you do that for many years and you just multiply the assets under management, we've made really good experiences that they start responding eventually. And what's very interesting now, and I'm going to speak a little bit about it later on in the supply chain management area, that companies are now, especially large ones, are now requesting their suppliers to respond to CDP. And there again, there's a clear lever that comes from an external stakeholder requesting this information. And we've also have some companies, some suppliers, like a car part manufacturer, that is requested by 45 supply chain members, or by 45 companies that are buying from this supplier, and they have to fill in that one questionnaire, which is then sent to all of them. So that's great, but there might still be the very big barrier initially to even start putting anything into public. They might be private. They might not have any experience with disclosing any kind of information to the public. So it's really, I think, that joint, and I don't really want to use the word pressure, because often there's a lot of support and collaboration needed to make this happen. But yeah, it's really what needs to be done. I think that's my favorite narrative.
Okay, in the Danish network, we're also working on creating a working group on climate starting January next year. And the ambition is, of course, to lead companies to make a 1.5 pledge, but we'll start at another stage. We'll start looking at what is a good ESG data for a company, what are the institutional investors looking for, and how can you start doing that very basically, because some companies, this is very complex. So we just want to make this the light version, and then we hope that companies can see that, okay, this is feasible, we can do it, we actually have the data, and then we can make a real pledge. So I also think it's a stepwise approach. I sense that a lot of Danish companies, also the smaller ones, actually want to make a difference and want to show the world that you are taking an ambition, but you think that jumping right into science-based targets is a little bit too much. Then we'll take the light version and then get more companies going that direction.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we try to balance that sometimes between keeping up the level of ambition high, and at the same time not leaving anyone behind, whether it's smaller businesses or really hard to abate sectors that are typically also have been further away from the consumer and just starting to really take these issues seriously now. And for us, it's fantastic to see that now this year, for instance, we've had Maersk committing, which is a great signal, but they don't have approved targets yet. But we have ThyssenKrupp and Heidelberg Cement as two of the few largest heavy emitters and large industrial companies globally with approved targets, both first ones in that scale in their sector. So that's also, in this area, a very great signal. So criteria. I don't really want to scare you off, and I don't know how useful it is, so I'll make it quick. And then we have that half hour in the afternoon to go into more detail if you tell me that that's actually useful. These are the overarching criteria of science-based targets. Every target that is approved on the website is aligned with them, or should be. These targets need to cover all company-wide Scope 1 and 2 emissions. You can only exclude 5% combined. The time frame are 5 to 15 years from the day that the targets are submitted to the initiative. They cannot have already be reached, so they need to be forward-looking. Companies are annually reporting on the progress, and it doesn't mean that they specifically reporting on the progress. You just need to, at some place, report your inventory. So it's also not on a super granular basis. And we ask companies to do a very high-level Scope 3 screening. Again, this does not have to be super detailed, because we just want them to start the journey, right? To look at the value chain, understand where the hotspots are, and then to set a target if this Scope 3 portion exceeds more than 40% of the overall Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I'm going to speak more about Scope 3 targets later, but for now, the interesting or the most important thing is that Scope 3 targets actually don't need to be science-based. They need to be ambitious and measurable. So the numbers that I showed before, the methods, can also be applied for Scope 3 if feasible, but they are for Scope 1 and 2 target setting. And also that change of ambition from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees, only for Scope 1 and 2, not for Scope 3. For Scope 3, we really recognize the challenges that companies are still facing in terms of data quality, data collection, target setting, collaboration, all these things. And so this is also why something that we really want companies to understand, because it makes that whole process a lot less scary for many. The level of ambition is what we already talked about. So it's really the core of a science-based target. It's really the temperature alignment. And what is also relatively new, and maybe a good transition to the session that we'll have after lunch, is that companies can also replace their Scope 2 target by setting renewable electricity targets that are aligned with global best practice, so to get to 80% renewable electricity by 2025 and 100% by 2030. This is 1.5 degree compliant, so to say. And and we really encourage companies that have a large share of Scope 2 emissions to communicate this as a key strategic pillar, and we're going to hear more about how that can be done in practice after lunch. And I'm around also if you have more specific questions. And this is just to sum up the relationship, because this can be very confusing, or we tend to get a lot of questions on what's the difference between SPTs and RE100, and why should we do this and why should we do that. And I think it helps to see science-based targets as this overarching frame, telling companies very, very specifically how much and how quickly emissions need to be reduced. So that framework, and then you're still left with, okay, what am I going to do to actually reach these targets? And a lot of companies take action on renewable electricity, on electromobility, on energy efficiency increases. And what we wanted to do with these initiatives are to set leadership standards or set best practice standards, again, in these key areas that companies are taking action in already. And in all of these initiatives, group the leaders, again, to learn from each other, to actually reach these targets, because we have a lot of companies sometimes in that they have no idea how to get there. And they want to gather with others in their sector to find solutions for the problems. And so this is one of the main benefits, I think, and how we see them linking together. And they're obviously not all equally applicable to every sector. So I hope to have given you a little overview for now, and happy to deep dive even more into the technical, practical, and after lunch or in the afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple
Other
of things
questions
up there. All companies' science-based targets are published on the website, I believe. That's correct? Just to answer that question, and why the different approaches? I think one of the questions up there, wouldn't the sector-based approach be more fair? And what are the pros and cons in the different approaches? If we could perhaps just take that one and then we can break for lunch.
Yeah. You could say the sector-based approach is more fair because it allows for growth, but only if you're in one of the sectors that actually needs to grow. And it just doesn't really work if you have a diversified business, because you have many different products. You can still set intensity targets, but the underlying ambition of these intensity targets needs to be aligned with the absolute contraction approach. We used to have even more approaches, and it's actually also was specifically demanded by the private sector to have more options, and also, yeah, we don't necessarily have the legitimacy to choose one and say, okay, this is the only approach that's science-based, because there's scientists that actually tell us that others are science-based too. What was the other question? Whether they're all on the website? No, that we already have.
The question, I think I answered it by saying that
They are.
somebody had asked for examples of companies' science-based targets. They're all on the SBT website. There's questions keep popping up on this subject.
Yeah.
So I think given the interest of time, we should be ready for lunch. We can continue the discussion over lunch and then maybe answer some of these as we go through some of the sessions in the afternoon, if that's right. But if I could get a round of applause for Sara and for Leah, that'd be great. So we've got 45 minutes.